So today we are very honored for the opportunity of having Mikhail Iampolski as our keynote speaker. Mikhail Iampolski is a Russian and American philosopher, art and culture theorist, film historian, professor of comparative literature, Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. His research interests include, beside literature and cinema, theory of representation, phenomenology of visual, the body and culture, and so on and so on. He has taught at Harvard University, University of Lausanne, and at the Moscow State Institute of Cinema Arts. He was a Getty Scholar at the Paul Getty Center for the History of Arts and the Humanities. Mikhail is a prolific author who has written extensively on aesthetics and philosophy, critical theory, art history and theory, film studies, culture theory, and Russian cultural history. So I won't probably have enough time to enumerate all of his books. So it's also very hard to pick up the most significant ones, but maybe I will try to do that. I think the most important book in the English-speaking world is The Memory of Tiresias, Intertextuality and Film by University of California Press. But he wrote a dozen of books also in Russian, for instance, The Demon and the Labyrinth, Diagrams, Deformation, Mimesis, Amnesia as a Source, Reading Daniel Harms, On Proximity, Essays on Non-Mimetic Vision, and one of his most recent books is titled Lion Trap, The Modernist Form as a Way of Thinking Without Concepts and Big Ideas. It's the book from 2020. In 2008, his monograph, Muratova, Essays or Studies on Film Anthropology, appears in St. Petersburg publishing house, Seance. It is a collection of essays about all the films of Kira Muratova at the time. In this book, Mikhail Iampolski characterized Muratova as essentially the only philosophically thinking film director of Russian cinema. In 2015, the book was republished in a second and expanded version. So the first book was shown by Irina earlier. So this talk is going to be in English, and the title is Muratova, A World Without Reality. So that's all I have to say. The floor is yours, Mikhail.
Thank you both, Irinas. I am very honored to be invited to this event, and I think it's something that that Muratova deserves for a long time to have. Finally, there is a big conference dedicated to her work. For me, this event was a pretext, the possibility to rethink a little bit Muratova, because I published my book on Muratova many years ago. I didn't revisit her work. And when I was invited, I was a little bit kind of, I don't know, confused, because I didn't know what could I tell after so many years not thinking about Muratova work. And it was a kind of impetus for me to try to find a kind of new general vision of what Muratova work is. And I gave the title to this speech, A World Without Reality. I would like just to start by explaining what do I mean. I think there are periods in history where reality is questioned, troubled, and almost disappearing. So there are periods of transitions where all kind of established pattern of reality are shaken. We can tell basically that something of this kind happened, of course, after the revolution of 1917, and Soviet cinema of the 20s was this kind of response of non-established vision of reality, of pre-existing as a pattern of reality. And we can tell that something, of course, not to such a scale as October Revolution happened during the collapse of socialism in Russia. And there was a kind of relatively short period of absolute intellectual confusion. And I think Muratova is somebody who is maybe in the best way, representing this feeling of lost reality. I met her during the period when she was thrown away out of the studio. She was not basically working. She was working as a cleaning lady in Odessa studios, and I met her in Siberia. Both of us were invited by our common friend Larissa Gersova to lecture in Novosibirsk, in Altai, in Tomsk, just to earn a little bit of money. And Muratova, because she didn't earn money, so she was eagerly responding to this invitation to get a little bit of money through lectures and through kind of meetings with spectators. And during the days we were earning money, and in the evening we were meeting in the hotel in Tomsk, and we had long and fascinating conversation with Muratova. When, it was basically the first time I met her. And it was a period of total kind of arrest of her career, but she didn't stop thinking about film, of course, and she was reevaluating what she did and rethinking about new kind of film. So what is this reality I am talking about as something that could disintegrate? For film, maybe it's the most important moment, because film was always considered to be a mimetic art. It's something that is imitating reality. You have reality, you have a camera in front of something, and you are shooting this something. And I would start by a quotation from Olga Freidenberg, from her book «Миф и литература древности», in which she is writing: «Нужно иметь представление о реальности, чтобы суметь ее воспроизводить. Эта реальность, прошедшая через переработку и интерпретацию человеческого сознания, объективно обнаруживается в том состоянии семантики, которое мы называем ее формой». So she is claiming that in order to reproduce reality, you have to have an idea of what it is. And this idea of what reality is always crystallized in forms. And I would like also to quote from Hegel, who in his philosophy of history is talking about reality as something that is acquiring the status of reality only through repetition. When something is happening only once, we are not taking it for real. It could be a kind of strange, random, contingent event that doesn't acquire the status of reality. This is quotation from Hegel. In all periods of the world, a political revolution, this is interesting, is sanctioned in man's opinions when it repeats itself. So revolution as such is not something that is creating reality. Revolution itself, it's a disturbance that doesn't acquire the status of reality if it is not repeated. Thus, Napoleon was twice defeated and the Bourbons twice expelled. By repetition, that which at first appeared merely a matter of chance and contingency becomes a real and ratified existence. This is a kind of great claim. You have to repeat something in order to acquire a status of a real existence. And there was a French philosopher whom I liked very much, Clément Rosset, who wrote a book about real and reality. Qu'est-ce que le réel? I think it's called in French. But he wrote several books on this topic in which he is repeating that only repetition is establishing something as real. So, but there are periods when this repetition doesn't happen. When everything is new, or everything is fundamentally unstable. All identities are questionable. all institutions are collapsing, and there is something that is a kind of something that could be, I don't know, could fluid reality. Muratova is explaining that she had a chance to work in a period between the dominance of ideology and the dominance of the market. And this is a period of freedom. I will quote from Muratova. Правила идеология. Теперь правят деньги. И между ними было межвременье. Временный рай. So between the reign of ideology and the reign of money, there was a period without time. It's kind of, it's a suspension of time. And she is calling it temporary paradise. Идеологии уже не было, а государство еще давало деньги. Вот в это время я и сняла перемену участи и астенический синдром. А потом власть денег заместила власть идеологии. Вот и все. So she is claiming that only 2 films she was able to make during this period of transition, of the suspension of time, of temporary paradise. It's перемена участи, the reversal of destiny, or how are you calling it in English, and asthenic syndrome, asthenic syndrome. And after it, she is entering into this realm of market. What does it mean, this kind of transition between ideology and market? There are 2 kinds of stereotyping. One stereotype, which is quite clear, is produced by ideology. I will not develop it because it's self-evident what is ideological stereotype. And another stereotype is produced by the demands of the market. You have commercial cinema, which is emerging, and you have different kind of types of stereotypes associated with commercial cinema. And it's something quite interesting because it's a reversal of what happened during the October Revolution, socialist revolution. There, we are dealing with a transition from market to ideology. It was a period between market and ideology, and nobody knew how to shoot. And it was completely experimental. And if you think about socialist realism, what is socialist realism? How to define and why it is happening? Socialist realism, it's an establishment of reality that could be realistically, in quotation marks, imitated. There is a possibility, new possibility of mimicry. Before socialist realism, it was experimental production of different kinds of realities. And on a socialist, it's an establishment of reality as something that could be imitated. I will not, of course, discuss how it should be imitated in socialist realism, but it's an establishment of stereotypes already. So in a period that Muratova is describing, there is a kind of reverse transition from ideology to market. But there are this is a similarity between two transitional periods. And in every period that is the period of transition, and for me, it's an extremely important moment. I think it could be an object of special study, how cinema is reacting to this kind of destabilization of reality. You are dealing with certain similarity. For instance, a rejection of psychologism or psychology, because psychology is very much establishing stereotypes. You know, for instance, that Stanislavski that developed this psychological theater, thinking that he was refining the individuality of acting and basing this acting on deep understanding of psychology, finally produced a limited set of psychological stereotypes. And of course, it is quite interesting to see that after the revolution, psychology was something that was energetically rejected. Mayakovsky was talking about psychology, psychologiство. It's a kind of psychological perversion, sexual perversion with psychology. And all these psychological stereotypes were absolutely destroyed by Kuleshov, who was studying with his models, naturщики, how to act without these psychological stereotypes and overcome them, and so on and so on and so on. So there is psychology is immediately rejected, and you will see that it's something that could be energetically rejected also by Muratova. Muratova is not recognizing this kind of psychological acting. It's something valid for her. And what is happening, of course, in after the revolution, it was the emerging of productivism, производственное искусство. Productivism is an attempt to deal with art without established forms. We have to produce something. It means you have to build, to change, but you have never to stabilize what you are doing in forms. And I'm coming back to forms that Fredenberg was mentioning as something that is establishing reality. So one of the theoreticians of productionist art, Arvatov, in his text, Everyday Life and the Culture of Think, is writing, the original material form of culture precisely as forms, that is, as detached skeletal formations, representing an extraordinary conservative force known as the everyday bit. So forms is extremely conservative. They're a material form of culture, and as he is calling it, skeletal formations. Everyday life consists of the fixed skeletal forms of existence. Бытие, the transformation of everyday life creation, бытотворчество, in which changes in bit will move in organic, constant, and flexible step with changes in бытие, will lead in effect to the liquidation of the everyday as a specific sphere of social life. The concept of the everyday was formed in opposition to the concept of labor, just as the concept of consumer activity was formed in opposition to that of productive activity. And the concept of social stasis was formed in opposition to the concept of social dynamism. So what we are dealing, so it's very Marxist to some extent, because Marx was claiming that labor is always alienated in commodities. And commodity is a skeletal form in which labor is alienated. And fundamentally, reality, everyday life of reality is made from the alienated skeletal forms in which labor is alienated. So I think that this kind of stress on productivity, on production, you can find it easily in montage. Montage, it's a kind of deconstructive practice. We are building something and deconstructing reality, and this is something which is not allowing a stabilized form to happen, because montage is based on conflict, at least in Eisenstein, but in conflict to maybe lesser degree in other forms of montage than Eisenstein's. And we are dealing with endless destabilization through montage. And of course, socialist realism is energetically rejecting formalism and montage as destabilizing productive stage of film aesthetics, if you want. Of course, when you are talking, and in Vertov, for instance, Vertov was always accused that his montage is destroying document. It was a big polemics by Lev with Vertov, that his montage is fundamentally a destructive principle and not a constructive principle, because it is destroying the value of a document. Of course, in Muratova, you have no labor, but I think we are dealing always, when you are dealing with this transitional period, so the disappearance of reality, as I'm calling it, with certain kind of productivism of destabilizing forms and rejection of realism as a mimetic dimension of film. So in Muratova, what is, I will focus on basically on перемена участи, or this kind of reversal of fate, which is a film of 1987. And I'm doing it on purpose. First of all, it's a first film that Muratova made after this period of suspension of his work. It's the first film that she is mentioning as a film made during this period of a suspended time. And also because I think that reversal of fate, it's not a kind of randomly chosen title for the film, because I think it's a big aesthetic principle that is becoming a dominant principle in Muratova's art. And she's explaining that перемена участи, it's a fundamental aesthetic element in what she will do later. So this is why I thought this film, for me, will serve as a kind of testing ground for something that I will develop later. So the first thing that is completely obvious in перемена участи, it's a rejection of the idea of identities. Identities are fundamentally important for film, for commercial film, and for ideological film. Because ideology and commercial cinema are producing stereotypes, functions that are moving the plot, and these functions have certain kind of identities. You have to recognize who is this person. It's a poor girl who is suffering, and this is a kind of predator male, or this is a kind of rich guy, or this is a proletarian, or whatever it is. So you can enumerate many different kind of fictitious identity. So what she is doing from the beginning, she is starting to build a world without recognizable identity. So first of all, she is choosing this strange geographical place. Where does it happen? You don't know. And she is making everything to make a recognition of identities in this film impossible. So I will quote from Muratova. Мы еще туда понавезли восточных людей, самых разных национальностей, чтобы всех совершенно сбить с толку. Для знающего глаза там необыкновенное смешение. И монголы, и китайцы, и корейцы, и киргизы, и таджики, и узбеки. И одеты они, киргизы, в узбекское платье. Дети узбекские в казахские одежды, а шапки киргизские. То есть мы старались максимально уйти и сбиться с географии, истории и сделать некую вещь специально, я бы сказала, невежественную. So everything is confused. Everybody is coming from different regions, but dressed in an absolutely weird dresses that are ethnically, culturally unrecognizable. And she is writing, and this is something extremely important for her. We had to pretend to be completely ignorant. This kind of innocence of vision, a total absence of knowledge. Knowledge should be completely eliminated from this world. А на адвокате будет шуба петровских или каких-то времен. А на актрисе будет современное платье, ультрамодное. А рядом вообще полуголый человек. А человек восточного вида будет брейк танцевать. А кто по национальности колонизаторы и местные жители, мы не хотим ни думать, ни знать. Мы не допускаем никаких англичан и вообще ничего не допускаем. Поэтому мы избегали разговоров туземцев между собой, чтобы не присутствовал какой-то конкретный язык. Полная свобода. Вот как хотим, так нагло и сделаем. Мы хотели уйти от конкретности, но в то же время все должно было выглядеть очень материально. This is very important. They are repressing language. They are repressing distinction between colonial peoples and colonialists. You shouldn't understand who is colonialist and who is repressed. And she is not allowing this kind of indigenous people to talk because it will allow to recognize their language, and language should be repressed because language, of course, it's a source of, it's a matrix of concepts, of identities, so it should be eliminated, and it should produce an absolutely kind of Babelian confusion, fundamentally, of everything. And what is very important, I think this kind of last sentence, that we wanted to eliminate every concreteness, reality. We wanted to eliminate reality, but to make it very material. You have to stress materiality, texture of this world, material texture of the world, but this materiality shouldn't be associated with reality. With reality in quotation marks, in reality, in a sense, I am using here. So there is this kind of strange things because reality is repeatable, as Hegel is claiming, and materiality is not repeatable. Materiality and texture of everything is completely singular. You cannot repeat the rich material texture of the world, but stereotypes producing reality should be repeated and are repeatable. So materiality of the world is something that should undermine this kind of stereotype reality. Reality is something that could be graspable. And she is writing that it's a total freedom. The thing that we wanted to reach, it's a total freedom of confusion, of all confusion, of all identity. Why it is so important for her, and this kind of ignorance, as she's claiming, it's something that you have to reach. It's an attempt by Muratova to block any symbolism and any deep reading of what is happening. Fundamentally, it's a blocking of understanding. Something that, or not maybe understanding, not, maybe it's a good word, but of knowledge, of knowledgeability of the world she is presenting. So everything should be enigmatic. And she is writing several times, this is a word that she likes very much. I liked very much this person, it was enigmatic, this character was enigmatic. So this kind of enigmatic dimension was important for her. And she is coining a special word to define this kind of approach. She's calling it primitivism. So it's, for me, it's something interesting because it's a word that was so much used by avant-garde artists at the beginning of 20th century, this kind of interest in primitive art and African art. So it's so well known that was used just to destroy the stereotypes of perception. And stereotypes of perception are very much associated with the idea of knowledge. So what is she is trying to achieve? She is trying to achieve, we have to elaborate a touristic gaze, a gaze of a tourist. It means a gaze of somebody who knows nothing about the place where he is, looking around, admiring something, and is able only to perceive surfaces. No way to go inside and to understand what really happens in this area. So it's a touristic gaze. So it's a fundamentally, it's a gaze of somebody who doesn't know and who doesn't understand. Let me quote from Muratova, and it is astonishing. Недоброжелатели вообще могут сказать, что мы смотрели на людей как туристы. Да, как туристы. Но как туристы, влюбленные во все, что они видят. So we are looking at the world as tourists, but tourists who love very much what they are seeing. Потому что там можно находиться сколько угодно, но не зная языка, дальше какой-то грани ты не продвигаешься. Доходишь до нее и все. So without knowing language, you cannot know what is in front of you. You are reaching very, very quickly limits to your knowledge, not going further. Контакты все равно остаются на том же уровне или там не возникает никаких контактов. То, что и называется, собственно, декоративностью. So she will talk about декоративная философия. And I will translate декоративность as ornamentality. It's an ornamental vision of the world. The world is an ornament. Декоративное что-то. This is the world of, this is a vision of primitivism. We are seeing a pattern. We don't know what does it mean. You can admire it, but you don't understand. So understanding should be blocked and ornamentality should be pushed forward. Когда ты любишь предмет, но не можешь дальше в него проникнуть, she is writing, и только любуешься его наружностью. So you like this object, but you cannot penetrate into it. So you have only to admire surfaces. So for me, it is very much interesting that this kind of idea of ornamental philosophy she will develop. Everything is on surface. But because everything is on surface, it's quite enigmatic, and you have to block your cognition in order to be in a normal, in a contact with reality that Muratova is constructing. Everything should be enigmatic. And this, the thing is eliminating everything which is dealing with justifications, motivation, symbolism, allegorism. All this stuff is completely eliminated. I remember the sentence by Nietzsche that I liked very much, that symbolism is a death of art. He is writing when he is claiming that music is a true art, and everything is dealing with music's interpretation, with verbal dimension which is added to music by Wagner. It's a horror. It's a destruction of our symbolism. It's something destroyed. So you shouldn't take it as symbolic. And in one of the interview, she is asked, что символизируют лошади в ее фильме in «Перемена участи». What horses are symbolizing in her film? And she is answering, а почему лошади должны обязательно что-то символизировать? А люди, что люди символизируют? What horses, why horses should symbolize something? And people, what people are symbolizing, she is asking. There is no symbolism at all. So it should be completely reduced to surfaces. And this is something which is very important for modernism, because modernism, to some extent, could be broadly defined as the discovery of surfaces. And it could be visible in photography. Benjamin is describing this long exposure in primitive photography that is creating some similarity to pictorial portraits, because during this long exposures, there is a kind of, if you want, synthetic accumulation of different micromimetic movement of the face. There is some kind of depth which is added by the time of exposure. And after it, you are coming to a snapshot, and snapshot is eliminating depth. It's something that Benjamin is describing so well. If you think about portraits by Avedon, Avedon is completely eliminating this kind of psychological dimension, this kind of depth of penetration inside or something like that, as a kind of bad taste in photography. You have only to register reality as it is. Fundamentally, you have to stop on surface and not to go inside, because it is becoming something unbearable to some extent if there is an attempt to go into this kind of search of deep meaning or something like that. But how to write a script and how to construct a plot for a film that is ornamental, superficial, and without depth and without psychology. And she is writing that she had always problems with completed, finalized scripts, because she was not very much interested. It was something she was finalizing. Everything is written already. There is no more interested in making a film from it. It's already finished in itself. And she is writing, for instance, that Перемена участи was so tempting for her as a script because it was not finally finished at the moment when they started shooting. Перемена участи всегда существовала как манящий огонек. Она никогда не дописывалась до самого последнего момента, и поэтому, наверное, она не потеряла для меня своей загадочной прелести. Желание, как у ребенка, игрушку разобрать и снова сложить. Так что это результат случайности. So she was interested in the script because it was not finished, and because it was a possibility to manipulate, to change, to reassemble, and fundamentally by this, it was incorporating the element of contingency. And contingency will play an enormous role in her thinking about film. So there are basically two models of script writing, which are always dominating film production. One model is to start with a plot. Of course, I'm schematizing and simplifying. It's never happening in a pure form that I will kind of claim existing here. So one thing is to start with a plot. You have a plot, and after it, you are trying to find characters for this plot and find actors who will fit to these characters. And because you are dealing in commercial cinema with endless repetition of the same plot, you have always very much stereotyped characters, which are emerging in all these action movies and all this kind of Western and whatever. So there is always this kind of stereotyping by plot. But there is another way to go into script writing. It's to start with characters and to try to find plot that will allow to this character to develop something. And maybe in a most radical way, this way of writing script was represented by Ozu. Let me quote from Donald Ritchie's book on Ozu, in which he is describing his work on scripts. The story or plot, I'm quoting from Ritchie, the story or plot rises from this character, or, and this is perhaps more common in traditional Western cinema, the story or plot forces the character to evolve in a certain way, and when an action is over and a change is observed, the script is considered finished. Ozu had little use for the latter method, feeling that it distorted character and destroyed verisimilitude, and not much more use for the former method. Plot bores me, he would occasionally say. The character became real with no reference to story or plot. He became real because all the words he spoke gave expression to those principles of his characters, which it was the writer's duty to discover. The result was the invariable rightness of the Ozu's character, a rightness based upon his being given an amount of freedom almost unknown to cinema character, since he had no work to do, no story to act out, no plot to advance. He could be contradictory, illogical, and always faithful to himself. So there is this kind of two-way, and other way is a way of certain freedom, which is quite important. There is element of contingency which could be incorporated because the plot is not completely determining the behavior, and the absence of plot is leaving some kind of space of freedom to the character. But it starts with the idea of character as something existing, of certain identity. It could be contradictory, it could be much more complex than when it is dictated by a plot. But still you have to and he's writing, and this is quite funny that he's using this word rightness. There is certain rightness of a character. There is something in a character that is, it's more virtual. It's no more kind of, if you want, established by a plot. There is kind of virtual space of freedom, but still it is established as certain kind of possibility of patterns, of different patterns of behavior. You cannot cross these boundaries of virtual identity of a character. So you have different kind of identities in a script which is dictated by a plot. Identities are, I don't know how to call it, kind of impoverished, simplified. In Ozu's approach, they are more rich, and there are elements of contingency that could be still incorporated, but it's also based on certain kind of identity. Muratova is absolutely uninterested in plot. She is claiming that plot is boring her, even if she is using something that could be called перемена участи, this kind of reversal of fate, which looks as an element of plot construction, but it's something very different in my opinion. So she is not inscribing characters into her plot, but she is not also extracting stories from characters and from their identity. She is using, I would like to call it, constructivist approach, quite similar to what was made in 1920s. So she is, I already briefly mentioned that she is paying a big attention to the materiality of the milieu, and she is explaining the materiality, the texture of the milieu will preoccupy her more and more and more and more. She is claiming that already in Познавая белый свет, spaces, chaotic structure and open spaces in which everything is happening are defining the behavior of characters. There is certain materiality of space which is already of great importance for her. She will explain that something, and when she is explaining that characters like horses do not symbolize anything, she is explaining: я символизмом в таком буквальном смысле не увлекаюсь. Да, убили того человека, его лошадь убежала. A person was killed, his horse ran away. So it's something, how she is feeling about behavior and the construction of plot. Тот повесился, его лошадь тоже увязала. Somebody hanged himself, and his horse also escaped. Почему? Why? I don't know. Не знаю. Может быть, в одном случае выстрела испугалась, в другом ее повешенный испугал. А понимать буквально, что лошадь ужаснулась человеческой цивилизацией и убежала подальше, значит вульгаризировать и упрощать. So there is nothing, and she's writing so to think that the horse was horrified by human civilization in this way, it is escaping. It's stupid. So she is running because maybe she was afraid. There was a kind of, I don't know, explosion. gunshot or something like that that make this horse escape. It's all. The horse is reacting to circumstances without any kind of premeditation, pre-construction. There is no plot and there is no character which is defining the behavior of a horse. And the horse should be used as a model for human behavior. So she is writing that at certain moment, basically thanks to Parajanov and to Hamdamov, she is discovering the material texture of humans, which is associated with costumes and with all kind of adornment that human beings are wearing. She's, and this is very important for her, to incorporate humans in a world of materiality and to make them something, part of material milieu, of material world. She's writing, Hamdamov, костюмы и бусы. Когда он мне говорил, что если ты бусы надеваешь на шею, то смотри, чтобы бусинки одна от другой отступали, для меня это было как яблоко падает, понимаете? И я полюбила одевать актрис, актеров. Это стало моим пристрастием. So when Hamdamov explained her how a collier should be made, construction of it, she's writing it's a kind of as Newton's apple for her. She's suddenly starting to understand this kind of material side of human beings. Not a character, not kind of interiority, not identity, but the ways they are dressed. And she's starting to pay an extraordinary attention to the way she was dressing her actors. So I'm quoting. Исследование характеров и столкновение человеческих характеров, их нужду друг в другу, их отталкивание друг от друга, слияние или разобщение, но существование характеров в определенной среде. Why people are attracted to each other, why they are evading each other. It could be understood only when they are putting them in a material milieu and making them a material element of a material milieu. Вот это второе, это меня всегда занимает. Необходимость создать среду, чисто декоративную, материальную среду, в которой существуют эти жизни. Necessity to create material milieu, ornamental material milieu, in which to put the life of the characters. У меня, то есть создать некий замкнутый мир, микро или макро, у меня всегда микро получается, но в общем неважно, некий мир, который был бы настолько в себе закрыт, являлся как бы вещью в себе. So she's trying to make a kind of closed material world in which everything is contained. And what is interesting, of course, we are dealing with different weird motivation of behavior. For instance, in Bed and Sofa by Abraham Rome, characters are behaving like Pavlovian dogs. When a male is seeing a female, she has an attraction to this female, they are sleeping together. When there is another male in the same room, they are attracted. So there is certain kind of mechanical dimension of Pavlovian reflexology. But in Muratova, it's not kind of sexual desire or this kind of Pavlovian reflexology which is dominating. It is a construction, spatial construction of the milieu, which is defining the configuration of spaces, if you want, which is defining the behavior of human beings. She's writing, баланс с тех пор с ранних фильмов несколько переменился, начиная с фильма «Познавая белый свет». Уже в нем есть перевес в сторону декоративного философствования по поводу окружающего мира. Меня всегда интересовал микромир человека и его среда. So she is writing that the balance changed after her first films, in this kind of materiality of the milieu is gradually acquiring bigger and bigger importance. And her main question is how people are defined by the materiality of the milieu, being material elements themselves. When I was thinking about this kind of weird vision of film construction, I was thinking that there is certain similarity between what she is trying to find and some kind of discovery of incorporation in art theory of 19th century. For instance, Wölfflin, who in Renaissance and Baroque, and he's speaking also a lot about ornamentation there, is claiming that the space of architectural constructions is non-understandable without its incorporation into bodily behavior. So I will give you a short quotation from Wölfflin. Now it is very unlikely that architecture should not participate in this process of unconscious endowment of animation. Indeed, it does so in the greatest possible measure. Moreover, it is clear that architecture and art of corporeal masses can relate only to man as a corporeal being. It is an expression of time insofar as it reflects the corporeal essence of man and his particular habits of deportment and movement. It does not matter whether they are light and playful or solemn and grave. Architecture expresses the Lebensgefühl of an epoch. And something similar was made by Schmarza, for instance, also a great art theoretician of 19th century, in which he is describing this absolute intense contrast between our experience of interiority of a building and exteriority, how they are never coinciding. There is always incongruence between the interior and the exterior, which is produce a kind of corporeal shock in somebody who is visiting such or such building. So so the space is very different from what was classical concept of film space, which is based on the combination of visible space and off-screen space. It's a space that is organized in a way allowing bringing together characters or separating them. So she is talking about certain physiology of looking at the film dictated by a space of перемены участи. Let me quote. И только в конце, когда глаза уже сильно устают от затхлости, погруженности в подвалы и темные помещения, появляются натурные съемки. Есть физиология смотрения фильма, поэтому ты даешь после темного светлое, после громкого разговора паузу. Глаз человеческий тоже хочет переменить свою участь. Он хочет увидеть что-то другое, выбежать на какое-то поле и там прогуляться. You see, the gaze, human gaze, is looking for a reversal of its own fate. So перемена участи is already something which is inscribed into the behavior of a spectator, that is the desire to move from interior to exterior, from something which is suffocating, close, to something which is opening. There is something interesting for me, this kind of understanding of a character is certain sets of circumstances and spatial constructions. It makes me think about Hermann Usener, for instance, idea of who are Greek gods, he was asking. And he was making a kind of attempt to think that gods are, first of all, the names of certain event. He was calling these gods Augenblick Götter, So it's a kind of momentary God. So for instance, there is a lightning, I don't know, tempest, something like that, and it has a name. After it, something is repeated. And this repeatability of event produces different set of gods that he's calling Sondergötter. And after it, there is only personality, great mythical personality like Zeus, Jupiter, something like that are emerging. So the name of a god is, first of all, associated with certain kind of circumstances, something, an event. Marie Delcourt, in her book, wonderful book about Oedipus, she is asking, who is Oedipus? Did Oedipus exist? It could be mimetically reproduced as pre-existing, as he's writing, primitive Oedipus. And she's writing, no, there was no Oedipus. Oedipus is a set of themes that are articulated between themselves. They are gestures that are gradually frozen or crystallized into a figure of Oedipus. So there is something of this kind that you can find in the kind of this ornamental philosophizing by Muratova, when there are different threads which are in different circumstances, different spaces, are producing some kind of strange contingent behavior. Fritz Mautner was using the word Zufallsinne. Zufallsinne, it's a kind of contingent, accidental meaning. Something is happening and it acquires certain meaning, like Oedipus in Delcourt. And перемена участи, this kind of reversal of fate, it's exactly what is happening as a kind of, if your main event in the behavior of a character. She is explaining what is перемена участи. Перемена участи – это идиома, старинный адвокатский термин, который вышел из обихода. Объясню на примере. Заключенный долго сидит в камере, лет 10, ему осталось сидеть, скажем, год. И вот входит надзиратель или первый попавшийся человек, к которому узник никак не относится, и заключенный как бы ни с того ни с сего его убивает. Он ни дня уже не может сидеть в этом помещении. Он хочет перемены любой ценой. Пусть даже его потом посадят еще на 10 лет. Таким образом, перемена участи – это бессмысленное убийство, которое происходит просто из желания уйти из этих стен в любые другие. Путь худший, путь другие. So there is a kind of absolutely unmotivated, there is no psychology, there is no stereotype behind it. Somebody is killing somebody that he doesn't know at all. There is no human relation, simply because he is really tired to sit in the same space forever. So to change his fate, he is able to kill, for instance. This is a kind of motivation which is completely beyond all known stereotypes. And you have all these unmotivated killings in Muratova. For me, of course, a set of killings in three histories, when there is one killing after another, and there is absolutely no motivation, no explanation why they are killing. There is pure, complete innocence, if you want, behind this killing. It's a pure manifestation of behavior without psychology, which is completely defined by the contingency of перемена участи. Перемена участи is contingent, and it goes against plot and against psychology. And she is explaining that the set of such events should be understood as a carpet that is creating a texture of the world. The texture in the world is created by such types of event. Картина мироздания действительно представляется мне очень разнообразным, приносящим много радости и таящим в себе много прелестей, прекрасным ковром с красивым узором, за которым интересно следить. Но в этом узоре обязательно есть черная ядовитая нить зла, которая сопутствует добру. Человек время от времени, впадая в наивное состояние, думает, что можно и ковер сохранить, и зло убрать, вырвать черную нить, но надежда вынуть эту нить из узора ковра, то есть аннулировать зло, не разрушив ковер, тщетная. So it's a kind of this kind of ornamental philosophy and this idea of the world as a carpet. It's also a very modernist idea. I'm thinking about an essay by Joseph Maschek, which was called Carpet Paradigm, in which he is describing the modern art as a fundamentally based on this idea of carpet. I'm thinking about Matisse, for whom carpet is a big model, or Foucault analysis of Manet, claiming that Manet is fundamentally dealing with creating of pattern on surfaces or something like that. So it's a very kind of important model for modernity, which is coming back to Plato's Chora. Chora, it's a space of individuation in which there is some kind of elements which are separated, something is united. And in a statesman, Plato is comparing this working of individuation of space to the art of weaving. He is talking about two elements which are involved in a weaving. One is, he is calling it kind of separation, diakritike, and another is unification. He is calling it synkritike. So there is this core is always connecting different threads, producing this carpet of reality from which there is certain kind of individuation of the world is emerging. And he is comparing, strangely enough, politics to the art of weaving. And we know very well that spinning of a thread was historically compared with fate. You know that Parke in Rome or Moira, fates basically in Greece, were kind of mythological beings that were spinning the thread. And from the thread, we are creating the carpet, if you want, the texture and the fabric of life. And going to her characters are very weird. She is explaining why she was so interested in Leblé as an actor to perform the main character in «Перемена участи». Вся эманация, которая от нее исходит, производит впечатление чего-то легкого, ранимого, порхающего, беззащитного. А когда ты углубляешься, ты натыкаешься вдруг на что-то совершенно стальное. В ней удивительное сочетание, которое парадоксально завораживающе воздействует и на меня, и, как я заметила, на многих. Это двойственно. Во-первых, очень интересно, как всякий парадокс, как всякая загадка, this favorite word, enigma, который заставляет нас все время вглядываться и пытаться разгадать. Во-вторых, необыкновенно подходит для этой роли, потому что героиня мне представлялась обязательно и хрупкой, и сильной одновременно. Было бы неприятно видеть физически сильную женщину, совершающую убийство. So fundamentally, this contradiction inside, it's something which is producing this перемена участи, this reversal. She is, suddenly she can fall in love, suddenly she can kill, or something like that. There is total absence of motivation. It's all kind of defined in a way she is describing for this character who is killing somebody just to leave the space of his confinement. So as you see, it's a totally outside Stanislavski's idea of psychological acting and in general the idea of acting as we know it. And this is why we know that Muratova's actors are bad actors. And she knows it, that they are acting in a very weird, strange way. Psychologically is never convincing. And this kind of absence of clarity, of motivation, of psychological dimension is something that she is liking very much. And something that is interesting for her, people who are unable to be actors. It means to incarnate characters. And actor or character are replaced by something that Bruno Latour called actor. Actor is a very weird thing. He is explaining that actor is somebody who is remotely similar to actor. And he's explaining this similarity. It is not by accident that this expression, like that of person, comes from the stage. Far from indicating a pure and unproblematic source of action, they both lead to puzzles as old as the institution of theater itself. Puzzle, very kind of favorite word of Muratova. As Jean-Paul Sartre famously showed in his portrait of the garçon de café, who no longer knows the difference between his authentic self and his social role, the word actor means that it's never clear who and what is acting when we act, since an actor on stage is never alone in acting. Play acting puts us immediately into thick imbroglio, where the question of who is carrying out the action has become unfathomable. This is why we should paradoxically take all the uncertainty, hesitations, dislocation, and puzzlement as our foundation. Just as actors are constantly engaged by others in group formation and destruction, the first uncertainty, they engage in providing controversial accounts for their actions as well as for those of others. So actor is, if you want, actor, but an anti-actor, because you don't know why he is acting, what are justification. There is always this kind of puzzlement, hesitation, dislocation, uncertainty, something that is so fundamental for Muratova's character. And it's something which is explaining this bad acting in Muratova. She is writing: «Я не переношу такую сугубо тяжелую, считающуюся почему-то необходимой для русских актеров манеру игры. Отошел к окну, вздохнул, переживая, вернулся к столу и сказал: я этого не люблю. Я всегда восторгаюсь Чаплином, который в краткое мгновение может создать потрясающую гамму сложнейших вещей, нюансов, переходов. Поэтому я всегда предпочту из двух актеров того, кто говорит быстро и при этом не будет съедать слова. This is extraordinary. The main thing is to speak quickly, fundamentally without thinking. It's almost automatic production, and in the speech of her characters, there is always this kind of endless, meaningless repetition of the same, which is so typical for their speech. She is explaining why he liked very much Lykov, who is also acting in Перемена участи. And the main quality of Shlikov is his ability to speak quickly. Он сразу выпадает из всех возможных штампов. У него удивительный способ играть, не актерский, а как бы примитивистский. The same word, примитивистский, primitivism. Как художники-примитивисты рисуют, так он играет. Вне актерской школы, напролом, как будто бы играет плохо. И в первый момент думаешь: да что это он так неестественно плачет, так притворяется. А потом он настолько приковывает себе внимание, что понимаешь, это человек, для которого естественно именно так плакать, вот такой он есть, замечательный актер. So it's always a primitivism, it's pure surface, it's a carpet paradigm in acting. And she will claim that she likes very much children, because children are not acting, but they are working in this kind of primitivist way, like primitivist actors. And her use of children in Melody для Шарманки, for instance, is showing you how she is admiring this kind of strange way of acting. She is interested very much in Kleist marionettes that are working without inertia, without any kind of detour through psychology. It's like in fencing bear in Kleist that couldn't be defeated by a human being, because human being, when he is fencing, is thinking, has a reflexivity, and the bear is reacting immediately, and this is why he is always better. So this is kind of, and marionette has no inertia. And it also makes me think about Michel Serres, who was talking about multidimensional existence of a body. Body is not psychologically defined, but defined by its inscription in many spaces. Let me quote from Serres. Aesthetics in the wider sense of the term that would attempt to take into account this multiple proliferation of spaces. My body, I cannot help it, is not plunged into a single specified space. It works in Euclidean space, but it only works there. It sees in a projective space, it touches, caresses, and feels in a topological space, it suffers in another, hears and communicates in a third, and so forth, as far as one wishes to go. And so on and so on. So my body, he is writing, therefore, is not plunged into a single space, but into the difficult intersection of this numerous family, into the set of connections and junctions to be established between these varieties. So the character is fundamentally somebody who is inhabiting different spaces. And this kind of inscription in different spaces is something that is defining its behavior. So and this kind of behavior is producing always this feeling of excess. There is something vulgar, bad taste, and she's recognizing herself that she likes very much bad taste. And she's even writing that bad taste is a real good taste. And this is a kind of vulgar excess of pure presence without any depth. It's something that she is trying to reach in her film. And she is writing that every character is opening oneself in a surprising way in a different space of interaction. But what is opened is never truth. And she is writing, правды нет никакой, вообще нет. Понимаете, есть мироздание, его хаос, и человеческий мозг не может постичь все это. So this kind of dissolution of truth is related to this dissolution of reality. When I'm talking about dissolution of reality, I'm talking about reality in quotation marks, of course, as a set of pre-established stereotypes. And truth is now associated with textures and with materiality and with singularity of the material. So instead of dealing with this reality in quotation marks, which is always questionable and always pre-established and always stereotyped, we are asked to deal with very different reality. Reality of pure materiality, of spaces, of inscription of the spaces, of texture, of different threads. This is something that materiality is excessive. It could be kitschy if you want, and she's claiming that Odessa and provincial kind of, I don't know, world she's living in is a very good material for this kind of excessive presence of textures, of material elements of life. So fundamentally, you have to go beyond this idea of reality that is disintegrating itself into the idea of assemblage. She is always talking that she is very much interested in heterology of the world. World is based on very different material elements that are not fitting each other well. She is using the word шероховатость, roughness. It never really fitting one thing to another very well. And this roughness of elements that are making this kind of carpet is something which is a mechanism producing intensities. And Deleuze was talking about assemblage. Assemblage for Deleuze is a combination of elements that are not fitting each other well. And it's something resisting totality and organicity. Totality and organicity, it's always leading us toward concept, symbolization, and reality, in quotation mark. It fits very well that reality is something that could be understood as certain totality, representational totality of the world. But assemblage with this roughness of parts that are always producing conflicts is resisting it. And for Deleuze, as much as for decorative philosophy or ornamental philosophy of Muratova, reality of the world, true reality of the world, if you want, it's something dealing with the impossibility of reality to establish itself. It's something which is going against this kind of temptation to replace this roughness by well-fitting stereotypes. This is something I would like to finish, and maybe just to make a distinction between reality and something that Muratova is trying to find. I think it could be even possible in a kind of unprecise way to use Lacanian term real. Real for Lacan, as we know, it's something which is resisting symbolization. So real, it's an instance that is not absorbed by the imaginary, by all these kind of totalizing images, or by symbolization, like father or something like that. So real is resisting. And fundamentally, reality that Muratova is trying to overcome is something which could be correspond very much to these two Lacanian worlds of the imaginary and symbolic. And what she is trying to restore to us is real as resisting. And and it's something which is paradoxical in Muratova, this kind of non-naturalness, vulgarity, bad taste, this kind of something which is troubling, bad acting, whatever it is something that is the way to open a kind of new vista on reality, on real, on the real, instead of reality. So this is some kind of few ideas that I would like to convey you. It's how I see now what may be the main contribution of Muratova to film. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich and very much intense talk. And I had a big egoistic pleasure to hear all the concepts I'm working with, dealing with Muratova. Yes, and I'm opening the discussion and remind you that you can ask the questions in either in English or in Russian. All questions are welcome. Пожалуйста, задавайте вопросы на русском или на английском, и можно писать в чате или поднимать руку. And yes. Please don't forget to unmute yourself. Okay, well, everybody is gathering for the questions. I will probably begin with. As I was really happy that you started talking about Muratova's roots in avant-garde. And I'm very sad that Isa Willinger, who was supposed to also take part in the conference, couldn't be today, and she withdrew her talk because she had some other plans for this year. And she wrote a book on Muratova in German, which is titled Kera Muratova, Kino und Subversion, but she also translated a part of it into English, and it's available online. And she considers Muratova under the vantage point of avant-garde. Yes, but what I am interested very much in is in marrying Muratova and Eisenstein. And I remember that you were talking at the beginning of your lecture about the form, about the skeleton or skeletal form. And I was thinking about what you wrote about Eisenstein in The Memory of Tiresias, about his fascination with the textual skeleton, with the line, this pangraphism. And would you see any connection between those two filmmakers?
Yeah,
thank you.
You know, many years ago, I wrote an article about Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible. So I was very much interested in his sudden shift from absence of developed characters. And you know that his work of the 20s was always named or called the film of collectivity. There is this kind of big collective portrait that he is doing, but never developing any kind of individual psychology or something like that, and rejecting deeply this kind of stuff. And suddenly he is focusing on a character. Alexander Nevsky is, of course, a very stereotyped image of mythical hero, if you want. But Ivan the Terrible is much more complex, and I started to work a little bit on his complexity of approach to a personality. And what was striking for me, and there is some similarity between Eisenstein and Muratova, that Eisenstein was confronting the idea of individual psychology and rejected the idea of individual psychology also for Ivan the Terrible. And there is a long story of defeat of treating Ivan the Terrible on stage in terms of individual psychology. First of all, it was during the production of Смерть Ивана Ильича, Ivana Grozного on MHAT stage by Stanislavski. And Stanislavski was playing Ivan the Terrible, and for certain time he was playing, but he was so unhappy with what he was doing that he stopped, and he asked Meyerhold to replace him. And Meyerhold replaced him and started to play Ivan the Terrible. And at a certain moment, he didn't know how to play him. And he thought that the best way to play Ivan the Terrible is to think about him as a deeply pathological, psychological type. So he even was playing the kind of, I don't know, fit of epilepsy on stage or something like that. And of course, it was not satisfying. In his notes, Meyerhold is writing, it is impossible to act Ivan the Terrible in psychological terms. And Eisenstein, at a certain moment, understood that it's impossible to deal with psychological approach to Ivan the Terrible. And he started to make a strange montage of different aspects of Ivan the Terrible, making this character to resemble many other well-known images. In one case, he is resembling, as is well-known, his teacher Meyerhold. In another case, he is imitating the appearance of Christ in Holbein, Dead Christ. In another case, he is reproducing the appearance of Mephistopheles, played by Shaliapin, and so on and so on. So, and this is something important because Eisenstein was always very attentive to the way he's inscribing the profile or the face of Ivan the Terrible into the frame in order to correspond to many, many different aspects that could be associated with him. And he was making him, as he is writing, negative and positive with Schulzki or with Staritskaya or something like that. He has always to resemble somebody. And he has absolutely no essence and no substance, no identity. There is no identity of an eternal. It's a collection of different images. And these images are completely contradictory because you cannot reconcile Mephistopheles, who is a kind of devil, with Christ. So is it Christ or is it Mephistopheles? It's fundamentally unclear. So it's a fundamentally montage of persona, of images that is producing this kind of character. So fundamentally for me, Muratova is always trying to put this perimenauchity, this kind of change aspects of from bad to good, from there is no justification and psychological motivation behavior. They are all confronting the same story of the impossibility of psychology on screen. And Eisenstein and Muratova, they are completely conscious of the fact that acting is terrible, that acting is always producing something false. And the best actor is fundamentally showing his skill or her skill, but it's never dealing with anything convincing. So there is always this kind of fundamental falsehood of acting. And Muratova is going into exaggeration of it through this kind of different kind of mask and vulgarity and bad acting and primitivism of acting, whatever it is. And Eisenstein is choosing its own way to deal with this impossibility of acting. I am very much convinced that acting is something which is unavoidable in film, of course, but it's a kind of, I don't know, it's something which is horrifying. Film is always suffering from acting because it's always, you always feel this is a good actor. You are looking at kind of, I don't know, British film with great British actors, and you know they are wonderful actors, and they know they are actors, and they are wonderful acting. And this is something that is impossible to overcome. So you can admire them because they are great craftsmen of acting, but it's always false. And it's a very different falsehood. And when I was talking about Stanislavski, who was going towards something that he was calling the truth of character, he's going toward truth of character and fundamentally producing the set of stereotypes of emotional states. You are always finishing by going into psychological truth by finding something which is completely contradicting this truth. So this is a kind of, if you want to, this is something that Eisenstein and Muratova were dealing with in a very different way. Of course, Eisenstein was not using method of Muratova, of this kind of ornamental philosophy or whatever it is, of this primitivism or whatever it is, but they are both were very much conscious of the impossibility of finding truth and reality through actors. And she's talking a lot about Renata Litvinova. And Renata Litvinova is, of course, not a good actor, but she is an interesting character. And this combination of cheap vulgarity with this kind of appearance of Hollywoodian diva, it was something that was fascinating for Muratova. I met Muratova in Riga once, and she told me, I found an absolutely extraordinary animal. This animal is Renata Litvinova. It's absolutely incredible, this being. You have to meet her. You will be completely kind of smashed by this character. So she was finding these kind of weirdos instead of finding actress. Leblanc, of course, that she was admiring so much, is not a good actress, of course, too, in terms of if you want traditional vision of what acting is. But she's interesting. She's interesting exactly because her bad acting to some extent. So this is something that is, in my opinion, they are fighting against the same problem.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have questions from the audience. There will be Vadim first, then Yin, and then Yulia Katkova.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for your great talk. It inspires lots of questions, and I will select just one probably because I was happy that you have selected the change of fate as a topic for this presentation, and because it has sort of personal, echo in my experience with Muratova films. So when the change of fate was released, I remember that it was a limited release, of course, and I desperately wanted to see it immediately. So I took a bus for Tartu and went to Leningrad. And my initial reaction, and at this time I already seen all her previous movies, my initial reaction was sort of disappointment, not an entire disappointment, but there were two pieces that completely contradicted to what I believed at this time to be Muratova's cinema. The first episode, I'm sure everyone remembers this, and you will probably understand why I'm talking about it. The first episode was about when we see a tiger placed in a cell who is making circles, and we see a ceramic pot in the center of this cage, And then next to this episode, we see Maria, Natalia Leblanc, sitting in her prison cell, sitting on a bed, and we see a chamber pot under her bed. That's the first episode. And the second one, that you already mentioned, at the very end of the movie, when we learn that Maria was freed, that all the accusations were taken off, and we also see that in a way her husband was taking himself free from all this trap that he fall in. So, and then we see this long shot with this galloping horse. So in both episodes, and I'm talking about this because you mentioned this Muratova's clear anti-symbolism. But what happens in reality of the movie? In both episodes, we see this adjacent, this continuation of two fragments, that this neighboring effect produces an effect of juxtaposition, similarity, metaphorical interpretation, in symbolism in her words. So would you mind to comment on that?
Yeah. When I was talking about this kind of kitsch that she used, that she liked very much, and I think this kind of superficial comparison, for instance, of tiger with Leblanc or something like that, is belonging to this almost ridiculous, by its vulgarity and openness, juxtaposition that could be usually read in symbolic term. Of course, it has nothing to do with what Muratova is trying to convey. She is not trying to compare her with a tiger or whatever it is. But I would like to quote you from Muratova, in which she is describing why she is choosing the story of Moem. Мне вообще нравится стиль этого писателя. В нем есть живая вульгарность, и пряность. Он соединяет понятие хорошего и дурного вкуса и создает свой живой и острый вкус. Рассказ написан в такой бульварной манере. Он использует первичные манки, которые на нас всегда воздействуют. То есть, когда мы видим красный цвет, слышим громкий звук, мы все реагируем примерно одинаково. Потом, немножко опомнившись, говорим: нет, это очень грубо, это не я, это другие люди попроще, а я, но тем не менее в нас есть и этот первый слой. В рассказе есть дешевая, зазывная, бульварная эффектность, на которую я клюю. Любовь, убийство, любовник, муж, следователь, адвокат. Читаю, скажем, дурного вкуса фразу, как адвокат увидел в глазах своей подзащитной красный зловещий огонек, мелькнувший в глубине ее зрачков. Я абсолютно точно понимаю, что это очень низкопробная литература. И в то же время чувствую, что мне это ужасно нравится. Мне так и хочется снять что-нибудь пугающее, страшное, дешевое, бульварное, эффектное. Все эти штампы составлены таким классическим образом, что представляет собой теорему, головоломку или конструкцию, очень примитивную и в то же время сложную, как иероглиф, в который я могу вложить все, что угодно, и в котором в то же время уже задана потрясающая и волнующая меня ситуация. So this is, I think it's a response by Muratova to what you are asking. So what is this kind of primitive symbolism, which is looks as something that you can read on this level? Mm-hmm. Tiger, or this kind of stuff, this kind of movement toward freedom of the horse or of character or something like that. But what is important for her that behind this kind of vulgar and extraordinary self-evident symbolism of very primitive comparison, there is suddenly we discover an extraordinary complexity, an enigmatic dimension of all this. So this is something I think she wants to find something striking for a spectator, but not exhausting, if you want, what she wants to tell. And of course, you can find this kind of vulgar elements of fairy tales, of this kind of primitive stuff. And this is also a part of primitivism that she's claiming for. So I don't think that any kind of sophisticated spectator will exhaust the reading of Muratova films by this level of comparison or metaphor or something like that. You are always immediately feeling that it opens very little and only leads us towards something much more confusing, even in the way they are behaving. And there is always this enigmatic side, as you know quite well, behind this visibility of very simple comparison. This is how we understand it.
I understand that, of course, these two episodes are not aiming to exhaust the whole poetics of this movie. There is also another example. So I see this mechanism as something objective, not like, we know that Muratova is much more complex, but we see what we see. So the effect of juxtaposition, we can attribute it to super sophistication, or we can say, maybe she plays against her own rules. Another example very similar to this one, Andrei Rublev by Tarkovsky, when we see the whole scene of, bearing the cross over the top of the mountain. And again, we can, one can say that, okay, the whole movie is about artist who's bearing his cross. So why this scene demonstrates this or represents this idea in a very succinct metaphorical way. So you see, and of course in Muratova, there is kitsch and kitsch. There is kitsch that are so superficial that no one can miss this idea. I mean, on the level of interpretation, that's so clear that at the same time, here, I don't think that that's on the same level of clarity, especially when we look at her intention. I would not be so sure that everything that she does should work towards one specific point. So in a way, you know, we can say that there are some examples of oversimplification and there are some examples of more complexity. And of course, like when we see this herd of ships, we can project it on people who we see in this movie, saying that she probably treats this heaps of bodies as herd of ships, or we can say that that's probably too obvious. You remember this too?
I can agree with you. You can have different levels of reading. Of course, one is not completely contradicting another, but there is always this kind of incongruence, which is very important for her. And what is important for me, it's a blocking of depth. It's always a blocking of depth. Even if you have a symbolism, it's on such a superficial level, it doesn't go into this kind of depth that Tarkovsky is always trying to reach. When you read his diaries of Tarkovsky, on the margin, he's drawing crosses. It's ridiculous, of course, but he's always in this kind of search of deep meaning. Something that is ridiculous for Muratova, because Muratova is more intelligent, of course, than Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky is extraordinarily gifted filmmaker, but Muratova is smarter, and this is quite obvious.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Vadim. So we still have at least 4 questions from the chat, and Ian Christie, please, it's your turn.
Hi.
Hi, Jan. So pleased to see you. Yeah.
Very nice to listen to you for the last hour or so. But I just wanted to go back to something you said right at the beginning, which I think was very striking. That idea of what you call a temporary paradise between the 2 eras, the era of ideology and the era of money. And this magic moment, let's call it, which Muratova occupied with Change of Fortune and with Asthenic Syndrome, which of course are very different, but they're occupying that space in ways that I think you very, very interestingly set out. It made me think sideways and to another film that seems to occupy that same space and do some of the things that you described Muratova doing in Change of Fortune, and that's Kaidanovsky's film, The Kerosene Seller's Wife. And I wonder if you think that's a good use of that concept of the temporary paradise to explain some of these films that were made literally during that period.
I agree with you that Жена керосинщика, this kind of wife of kerosene seller, could be treated in a very similar way. And there are other films, for instance, Окраина by Lucek, or kind of, I don't know, Naga. There are films that are suddenly dealing with this extraordinary instability of identities and unclarity of the world. And for me, it's the most extraordinary kind of films that are suddenly discovering that the world is no more fitting into pre-existing models. My feeling is that it's not studied enough. That this period should be studied in a very special way to see what are the strategies of filmmakers that are trying to catch something which is escaping their understanding. Because what is clear in all these films, they are no more pretending to understand. Kaidanovsky doesn't know what is the meaning of the moment.
Yes.
This time.
So I agree with you totally. It's a period which needs more focus. And
yes, more focus. Yes.
And I'll just say that I don't know whether any of your writing from that period is widely available, but you were writing actually at that time with those columns for Soviet film.
Yeah, but I have always the feelings that I do not understand. This is why I'm still in this happy moment.
Anyway, those were wonderful texts then, and what you've just said, you're thinking about Muratova, I think connects across all that period of time with what you were already diagnosing at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Yin. We have a question from Yulia Katko, which I have to read because she has some trouble with the microphone. Thank you very much. I really like your book about Kira Muratova. I think that Muratova was a single film director who knew all about human being. I would like to ask you, why do you think Muratova used repetitions in this speech of her film characters? That's it.
So this is a question, of course. She's telling herself why people are repeating. And this explanation, of course, is funny, as many things that she told, but not telling a lot. She is claiming why in opera they are always singing many times the same thing. I'm dying, I'm in love, I'm in love, I'm in love. So why I couldn't do it in film? So it's a kind of operatic dimension that she is referring to. But my feeling is that there are two elements. One element is the element of excess that I find very important for her, but not in a simple way of repetition as establishing reality. There is something that there is a book by sociologist Geiger, which is called Saturated Personality. There is a kind of topic of saturation that was developed by Jean-Luc Marion, French sociologist, for instance. And he is writing that saturated phenomenon, it's something which is invading you. There is something that you cannot avoid, and it's producing you into a kind of passive receptor of something which is invading you. And you cannot avoid it. And there is this kind of excessive presence that is very important, in general, I think, for Muratova. And for me, the first trying of excessive presence is in Dolgi Provody. Dolgi Provody is still a psychological drama. It's much more traditional. I think she is starting to move from psychology in Poznawая Белый Свет, where psychology is basically disappearing and spaces are becoming more important. And she is recognizing herself that materiality of the world is becoming fundamental from Poznawая Белый Свет. But at the end of the film, the most memorable episode of Dolgi Provody is an excessive presence of the mother, which is troubling. You cannot avoid this mother. Mother is a kind of traumatic presence. Strangely enough, it was Lacan who was theorizing lack. Always subject is produced by a lack. He was writing that there is overpresence, which is extraordinarily traumatic. And he's claiming and he's writing, and the main model of this overpresence is the overpresence of a loving mother, which is destroying your freedom. It's destroying the space for your maneuvering. It's something which is invading you. This is a kind of element of saturation. And this kind of endless repetition is for me this kind of not only operatic, but in opera it's also invading. It's also something which is saturating to some extent. And this is something that is important. And there is another aspect for this repetition, as I understand it. It's a stressing of the materiality of language. Language should be understood not as a transparent medium conveying meaning, but as a material object. And in Muratova, it's extraordinarily important, the texture of words that are fundamentally without meaning. They are talking without telling anything. But words are acquiring the same dimension as this adornment that she's talking about in relation to Hamdama, for instance, something like that. It's a pure materiality of language overcoming its symbolic dimension that is produced by this endless repetition. Of course, this repetition, for instance, in чувствительные милиционеры, they are completely extraordinary. They are all these people like automatons without anything to tell. They are always producing these material objects that are words. This is, and it's undermining of meaning. If you are endlessly repeating the same thing, you are undermining the meaning of what you are telling. You are transforming it. It's a pure materiality of sounds.
Thank you very much. I just a reference, a remark on the margins in your phenomenology of excess that you developed, and which is inherent indeed in Muratova. I think there is one reference missing is Jean-Luc Marion, who developed this phenomenology of excess, and he speaks explicitly of a phenomena of saturated phenomena.
I mentioned Marion.
Ah, yeah, sorry, I missed it.
Yeah,
sorry.
I mentioned Marion.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Irina Gradinari.
Я задам на русском языке, я извиняюсь, надеюсь, что все более или менее понимают. Спасибо большое за замечательный доклад. Я хотела спросить насчет, не знаю, даже как два вопроса в одном, по-муратовски будет, два в одном. Возможно ли избежать полной десимволизации образов? И, может быть, это... ну, и зритель как бы ищет, где вот остались образы, и какой-то вот остаток остается, и там, и тогда зритель радуется, что он хоть что-то понял или хоть что-то нашел в фильме. А если нет, ну, я сама не знаю ответа на этот вопрос, поэтому задаю, а если нет, то и почему я задаю вопрос, этот второй вопрос, в чем заключается политическая сила этого кино? Потому что я все равно верю, ну, вы описали очень интересный момент, что вот мы сталкиваемся с материальным миром, с некой формой материализации, которая не является больше образной, символической, аллегорической. И, конечно, такая форма мира приводит она к эссенциализации или нет. И мне хочется верить, что все равно Муратова, все равно ее кино политическое или имеет какие-то политические эффекты, хотя бы потому, что она разрушает наше привычное восприятие. Но я вот не могу ухватить, как вы думаете, есть ли сила политического в ее кино? Потому что авторское кино, как правило, всегда именно несет с собой ауру политики формы. Спасибо большое.
First question is about the possibility to produce a totally non-symbolizable work. I think it's impossible. I think our mind is constructed in such a way that you are always producing forms, trying to name these forms. You cannot exclude language, of course, for any kind of perception. And there is always something which is leading to recognition and to certain kind of stereotyping. So, but the problem is not, of course, to produce something totally unsymbolizable and uncognizable, but to open a new dimension for our perception, to if you want to shift this kind of stresses from something which is stereotyped to something which is a material texture of the world. And it's something that she is doing in her way, I think, and this is very important. And it leads us to your question about political dimension. Because I think the political dimension of art is to go beyond stereotypes and beyond ideologies. When I'm dealing with an art that is ideological, even with best intentions, fighting for equality, for the best ideals of our society, whatever it is always for me suspicious. Because if you want to do something of this kind, start your political fight. Go into politics. But if you are dealing with art, the art is trying to overcome stereotypal thinking, to open a new dimension of thinking, to allow you to grasp reality in a kind of non-cliched way. And this is a very big political importance, because you have to start to think about reality and its complexity, overcome all these kind of cliches which are produced by political leaders, by parties, by political movements, something like that. So I think art is always against something which is established, and prejudices, things against which we want to fight, is something unfortunately established. So you have to overcome something which is established and open new dimension of perception and understanding for us. This is for me the main vocation of art. So when, from this point of view, I think it is political. There is also a political dimension in Muratova. I think it's a satirical element in her work when she is showing, for instance, people who are pretending to be new bourgeoisie or new elite in what they are, or something like that, and making them this kind of ridiculous clowns or whatever it is, and ridiculizing this kind of grand eloquence of speeches or something like that. So I think it also has a kind of clear political dimension, but I'm not thinking that this kind of satire is important, but it couldn't change the world's satire. But the way we are called to think differently has, for me, a big political importance.
Thank you very much, Irina. The next question from Natasha Drubek. Natasha? Natasha?
Hi, here I am. Yeah,
Okay.
I have only my voice, not the camera today. So yeah, I would just read what I wrote. It was, first thing is, a very inspiring talk, and thank you for introducing the metaphor of the rug by quoting Kira Muratova, who said that we cannot remove the like thread of evil, and if I understood that correctly, otherwise the textile or the text, the rug, the carpet would fall apart. But isn't this what we see in her films, this very procedure in its materiality, facturnost? Is this where Muratova picks up Eisenstein? His Mexican project, which was never finished, his first post or, well, anti-avant-garde attempt. Is she continuing to weave and perhaps dissolve his carpet? I argued recently that his Mexican project as a form of structuralism is hers then post-structuralism. Eisenstein used this metaphor of the rug, or he uses the Mexican version of it, the sarape, when he speaks about his film as having no plot. Eisenstein's concept, of course, is closer to structure than Muratova's, or perhaps a score for an orchestra, where the weft is not a plot, but rather pushed by a rhythm. struggling with the metrics of visuals, the warp, and that is back to Muratova's black thread.
I'm glad you mentioned this kind of weaving in Eisenstein. And of course, this kind of weaving is always in Eisenstein associated with incorporation of two conflicting or apparently contradictory elements. One, he could talk, I don't know, about sensual thinking, about pure touch, for instance, or sensibility, and another is abstraction. And there is elements of abstraction and elements of sensible, which are always coming together and creating this kind of carpet or this texture or this fabric in Eisenstein. And there is very difficult to separate them. I think what is distinct in Muratova, Muratova is absolutely not interested in this kind of element that Eisenstein was always exploring, this kind of conceptualization, abstract thinking through images. There is always in Eisenstein this kind of idea that you can, from something sensible, to go up, and for him it's always going up. It's very Hegelian, towards something non-representable. And you mentioned a rhythm. A rhythm for him, as you know very well, is the highest manifestation of abstraction. We are dealing with something sensible. From this something sensible, we are extracting the schematic element that could be rhythmically represented. Rhythmic, we are already in abstraction. So this is something that Muratova is absolutely uninterested in. She is not trying to, if you want, extract abstractions from the sensible. And it's something that I find is the big difference between two kinds of modernism. One is Eisensteinian modernism, which is very complex phenomenon. And complex exactly because he's never satisfied with the pure surface, with the pure appearance. He's always trying to overcome pure appearance. And why he's doing it, I think, because like Muratova, he's very unhappy with mimetic dimension of film. So film is something which is by its nature copying reality, producing copies, images, and it's mimetic thing. And montage is something overcoming mimetism. And we are going into something that is not mimetically representable. You are already in cinematic mechanism in Bergson. There is already kind of abstraction which is incorporated in film, and something like that in his text about the era of Georges Méliès, where there is a kind of non-coincidence on conflict is already producing abstraction. So you are always, he's obsessed with abstraction. The question, of course, is what is this abstraction? What kind of abstraction is produced by reason, something like that. I will not go into talking about this very thorny question, but it's something that Muratova, fortunately, is completely ignoring. It's a texture of pure materiality, and she's completely satisfied with materiality. She's never claiming, I am dressing my characters in such costumes because these costumes will allow me to express a metaphor or a symbol or something abstract. It's a simple increase of materialities she is interested in. And from this point of view, I think Muratova is more modernist to some extent than Eisenstein. Eisenstein is modernist, who is always looking back towards symbolization and abstracting. And it's quite interesting because there is a lot of people like him at the beginning of the 20s, for instance, or things like that. But of course, this is quite interesting when Nietzsche is talking that music is better than words, because music is not symbolizing anything. At the same time, Eisenstein takes music, Prokofiev or something like that, and immediately trying to find rhythmic scheme that could be symbolized or abstracted. So this is something that is interesting in what Eisenstein is doing. And it's something which I find fundamentally distinct from what Muratova is doing. At the same time, I think Eisenstein attempt to find abstractions and concepts and something like that, constant failure. He was never able to produce any kind of convincing abstraction, I think, in spite of all his explanation, endless explanation, how he's doing.
Thank you very much. And the question I have to read too, because Irina Denishenko had to leave. Thank you very much. It's a quote already. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking talk. I'm completely convinced by the ornamentally argument. And I really appreciate the primitivism connection as well, as it is something I've been thinking about, and you provided some clarity and new connections for me. My comment question is a follow-up to Vadim's point about the gap between Muratova's statements and her actual films. I would like to push back on the absence of psychology in Перемена участи in other films like Three Stories. Maria killed her lover, as it is revealed toward the end, because she wanted to prevent her lover from leaving her for the Tuzemka. It seems that in this film, as well as in Three Stories, what is being undone is the psychology of the 19th century literature, Lermontov, Dostoevsky. To my mind, what we see in these films has more to do with a reversal expectations set up by certain texts, literally or otherwise, rather than a downright rejection of psychology in favor of neutral surface observation. I would appreciate any thoughts on this issue. Thanks.
I would like to find, I have somewhere a quotation exactly about this pseudo-psychology that is finally emerging in that she is when finally she is killing him to prevent his leaving her. It's how Muratova is defining this kind of behavior. Она не просто притворяется и вводит мужа в заблуждение. Я считаю, что в ней наступает некая перемена, появляется новая ипостась. Она вдруг увидела его другими глазами и вдруг полюбила, как ни странно. Это перемена участи. Но есть одна фактически, то есть она фактически искренна во всех отношениях с людьми и одновременно неискренна, но только в той примитивной форме, что буквально боится наказания. Вот такие сплетения, казалось бы, противоположности, которые возникают на крохотном маленьком поле в душе человеческой, это, наверное, главное, что меня притягивало в сценарий, потому что меня всегда интересует две стороны. So fundamentally, she is trying to explain this kind of situation in a possibility of mutually excluding motivation. She's sincere, she's completely non-sincere. And it could be at the same time. So she is in love and she's not in love. So this is why I was kind of talking about Latour actor or kind of, I don't know, Michel Serres incorporation in different spaces, because there is something which is overcoming the clarity of psychological explanations. And what Muratova is trying to do, she is giving you certain kind of explanation, but at the same time, for her, it's never exhausting. It's never what it is. There is always another side. And when Latour is talking about this kind of actor, you don't know what moves this actor. It's a result of many circumstances and many forces, and it could move into different directions. This kind of contingency producing перемена участи, it's something beyond simple psychology. So I'm talking, of course, about, when you are talking about such a complex artist as Muratova, you are always simplifying. You want to extract a kind of, if you want, principles that are leading her. Of course, it's much more complex. Sometimes she is incorporating elements of something that you call psychology or acting or whatever it is. So it's never pure. There is no pure work of art at all. In general, it is simply impossible. But I'm not denying the possibility of very different layers of reading, like in this kind of metaphor with tiger or something like that that were already mentioned. You can do it. But what is for me most important is her attempt or her desire to go beyond it, even if she is sometimes using such elements. But when you're thinking about the core of what she's doing, you see it's fundamentally anti-psychological. And here you can agree probably with me, because all these characters are weird. We should recognize they are completely not similar to our stereotypes.
Thank you very much. And we are taking the last question because we are running already quite late. Anya Tropnikova. Anya?
Sorry.
Yes, you're here. Because
I'm here, yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you very much, Professor Iampolski. I was delighted to hear your talk, every bit of it. I wanted to ask you a little bit in regards to your claim of Muratova's kinship with modernism. Doesn't her position temporally after postmodernism resist this categorization? Could we argue, if such a concept exists, of course, I'm not sure, could we argue that because she's reacting to postmodernism, her embracing of materiality and rejection of symbolism could be a postmodernism? How, in your view, is the meaning of such a gesture different from the modernists of the avant-garde?
Listen, I'm always very cautious as soon as you start to talk about postmodernism. We can almost immediately recognize some elements of so-called postmodernism in her, because there is this kind of very heterogeneous structure of everything. Everything is going. There is no purity. Something that she is avoiding is very much purity. And at the same time, more I'm thinking about modernism, more I am suspicious about the idea of purity of modernism. Modernism is also very impure. So what I find important in modernism, and my last book, Ловушка для льва, it's about modernist form. It's an attempt to overcome this conceptual thinking and to think in terms of form. And form is the configuration of different elements that is producing meaning, which is very often not verbalizable. So, you know, there is this kind of idea in Benjamin of profane illumination, when different elements coming from different times are suddenly coming together and giving you certain kind of illumination. You suddenly start to see similarities, for instance. And similarity and analogies are something that is so important for Benjamin. And I think modernist form is to some extent such a constellation that is called to produce this kind of illumination, understanding, but this understanding is not verbalizable very much or conceptualizable. I think you can understand without transforming everything into concepts. What is happening in postmodernism, if we would like to extract this kind of postmodern substance, if you want, from it, it's tolerance towards stereotypes that is very much rejected by modernism. Modernism is reacting toward this kind of inflation of words inflation of concepts. It becomes impossible to use language in a traditional way because it is telling us nothing except this kind of cliche and stereotypes. And postmodernism, with this kind of tolerance toward low art, toward market, toward stereotypes, is something which is dissolving, if you want, this purity of form, mixing it with concepts, or kind of bad concept, if you want, or kind of, I don't know, stereotype concept. The question is Muratova fitting into this postmodern model as I see it? Maybe I have a very wrong vision of what is postmodernism, which is quite possible. I don't think so, because she is using a lot of vulgar, kitschy elements, but she is so much conscious and ironic about these kitschy and vulgar things. She's never taking it for granted and never accepting it without, I don't know, gesture of ironic rejection. You feel immediately that she's using all this kind of set of stereotypes just to laugh, but not to take it seriously. And from my point of view, it's a kind of something that could be called postmodernist in form because of this kind of heterology and bringing everything into her film. But at the same time, there is this kind of modernist trend of rejecting this flat, overbeaten, and completely inflated set of ideas. So this is, in my opinion, very modernist impulse, kind of impetus, which is existing in what she's doing, even if on the surface she is incorporating everything and very tolerant to very different elements. But I think it's more belonging to this idea of assemblage. This is why I used Deleuzean assemblage. And I don't think that assemblage and postmodern object is the same thing. I think it's something quite different. And it could be an interesting discussion, what is assemblage in relation to postmodernist object, but we will not go into it. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I think so. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you very much to everyone for this wonderful, productive and fruitful discussion. And we are going to finish for today and see you all tomorrow at 3 p.m. Berlin time.